For the materials, you'll need about 1 yard of fabric, waistband elastic, measuring tape, pins, sewing pattern, scissors, and chalk. See the description for more info about these materials, and for a link to the sewing pattern used in this video. These boxers are made from 3 pieces of fabric, 2 front panel pieces, which are identical, and a single back panel. First off, we need to cut 2 front panel pieces. With the fabric folded in 2 layers, trace the pattern and then cut it out. After this, you'll end up with 2 mirror image pieces. With the fabric folded in 2 layers, line up the fold line of the pattern with the folded edge of the fabric. Trace the pattern and then cut. The first seam we will sew is the crotch seam. While many boxers have a fly, this boxer pattern instead uses a standard flat-felled seam. The point of the flat-felled seam is to encase raw fabric edges and prevent fraying. Without encasing a raw fabric edge, fabric can unravel. Here is a worst-case scenario of what an unraveled seam can look like. A flat-felled seam is made by placing one fabric edge inside of a folded edge of fabric and then stitching the fold down. Here is a quick demo of the flat-felled seam. With right sides facing out, sew 2 pieces of fabric together with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. The 2 pieces of fabric are then pressed open. The thin sections of fabric next to the stitch line are called seam allowances. One seam allowance is cut short. The other seam allowance is folded over the cut seam allowance. If you like, you can use an iron to press the fold down. The folded edge is then stitched down. Here is the finished flat-felled seam. Notice that there are no raw edges of fabric showing. The top is neatly finished with 2 rows of stitches, and the bottom has a single row of stitches and is nice and flat. Much of the sewing for these boxers will use the flat-felled seam. Now we start sewing. First we'll join the 2 front panels by sewing the crotch seam. To sew the crotch seam, we layer the front panels with right sides facing out. Then sew with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. We cut the seam allowance of the right panel in half. Then we fold the left seam allowance in half and cover the right. Then sew along the folded edge. Next we join the back panel to the front by sewing the inseam. Layer the back panel and front panels with right sides facing out. To help line the pieces up, we can pin the middle of the back panel to the front crotch seam. Then we'll sew them together with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Then we can finish the seam. First we cut the front seam allowance in half. Then fold the back seam allowance to cover the front. Then sew along the folded edge. Now we can sew the sides together. Here we're starting with the right leg. With right sides of the fabric facing out, line up the front and back edges of the right leg and sew with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Finish the seam by cutting the front seam allowance, folding the back seam allowance over the front, and sewing along the folded edge. Because the leg we are sewing is now a tube, be careful to keep the needle area clear of any extra layers of fabric. Repeat this process for the other leg. To prepare to sew the hem, flip the boxers inside out. To shape the hem, you can make a double fold by rolling the fabric with your hands. Then sew along the folded edge. Continue all the way around the leg hole. Repeat this again for the other leg. Now onto the waistband. Prepare the boxer waist by pressing a 1 centimeter fold along the entire waist opening. For sizing, I recommend using the measuring tape to measure your waist size and then subtracting a couple inches. Take your cut waistband and sew the ends together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I recommend sewing at least 2 runs of stitches for added strength. Now we will prepare to sew the elastic into the boxers. The elastic is shorter than the waist opening, but we want to sew it in evenly. To help position the elastic, we will draw markers and pin the elastic into the waist. With the chalk, we'll draw markers to divide the elastic into 4 equal sections. Similarly, draw markers to divide the waistband opening into 4 equal sections. Next, pin the elastic into the boxers, making sure to match the markers in the elastic with the markers in the boxer waist. Now we'll sew the elastic into the boxers. We'll sew 2 rounds of stitches, starting with the top. While sewing, make sure to pull the elastic tight so that the length of the elastic is even with the waistband fabric underneath. Repeat for the bottom edge of the waistband.